Hello, and welcome to Pivotal Moments HQ, a podcast sharing, exploring, and celebrating stories of change through mindset and wellness and their impact on relationships. We are all agents of change and have the power to pivot at any point, at any time. I'm your host, Siria Gutierrez, along with my co-host, Melissa Robena. On this episode, we continue our series on the resistance to change, taking a deeper look at the status quo. We discuss regret aversion, loss aversion, and the sunk cost fallacy.
So this is the third, right? The third?
Yes,
of our resistance to change series. And this time we're going to focus on the departure of the status quo.
Yes, the status quo. This one's actually really powerful because a lot of people just fucking hate and resist the change because it does threaten the status quo.
It's funny because in counseling, I remember, talking about actually one of my biggest turnoffs in people, not even just romantic relationships, are when people just go with the status quo because it's easier rather than putting in the work. And this was actually kind of a sore point for my husband and I for a long time until I really understood that, almost like the psychology behind the status quo and why people do nothing.
So what I'm hearing here is that you got really tired of your vanilla missionary sex. Is that what I'm hearing?
Oh, read between the lines. Read between the lines.
I don't want to read between them. I want them all spelled out because we are on audio and on video, but mostly on audio. And I want to make sure that everybody understood that that was indeed a sexual reference. Hey-o.
No, but I could not understand how people were just fine staying where they were. And so I learned that obviously when the decision or to make a decision isn't clear, oftentimes we will fall back on what we know. Mm-hmm. And so when I was kind of collecting information from this, some people argue that the status quo actually doesn't qualify as decision making because some believe it's a form of decision avoidance. And I was like, mind blown.
Interesting. But it is a decision. Just because you don't make a affirmative decision and you're defaulting to basically the default, that is a decision, that is a choice. So I'm curious as to how they try to distinguish that.
Maybe because, I don't know. I mean, for me, that resonates with me because if you're not making a decision, if you're choosing to stay put, you're not making a move forward or move backwards, you are just staying where you are. I could see how that would be a form of decision avoidance.
Oh, I could totally see that it's a decision avoidance. My point is more of people when they're in that decision avoidance don't seem to want to recognize that being in that space, bro, you are actually making a decision to be in that space, to be in that uncertain place. And I know one of the things that would come up for me in therapy was when I was in that, especially when we were straddling, are we going to have kids? Are we not going to have kids? We were going back and forth with that. As soon as we made a decision, it was so much easier. But being in that space of, decision avoidance, or more of weighing it, right? In that analysis paralysis, the longer I was in there, the more I was just tormenting myself with everything. And finally it was like, you know what? No, the answer is no. All right, cool. Now I can actually move forward. It was like staying at the fork, being like, I don't know which way to go.
I can understand and relate to that. Once a decision's made, there's going to be consequences to whatever decision you make, whether you stay put, whether you go back to school or whatever, have kids. There's going to be consequences. They can be positive consequences. They can be negative consequences. But at least you're moving in a direction and you can then deal with it rather than just being stuck in that emotional muck. Mm-hmm. I hate that place.
I mean, it's not a fun place to be in. And I think that that's why it was such a struggle to be in this space of indecision, right? And so that's why it's funny, we claim as humans that we like variety, we like choices. But I can tell you that every single time I go to a certain restaurant, 9 out of 10 times I'm getting the same damn thing over and over again. And even when you look at your overall food choices, we end up eating the same things over and over again.
I agree because it's funny that you should say that because I think we were both looking at the same sites for for this.
That's only because you were looking at what I was doing earlier today.
No, actually, you copied me. If you look at my show notes, dated July 15th, I got this first. So anyways, but it's called, what you're talking about is regret aversion. And I'm like you. I get the same thing every time I go to a restaurant.
Yes.
And so, sometimes I'll get a wild hair at my ass and be like, ooh, let me try like the pecan crusted salmon. And then it's garbage. And then not only did I hate my meal, I hated the experience, I hated the outing and regret going out. Mm-hmm. And so, no, I totally relate to that.
So that's something that we do just in general, where we are, constantly doing that. And so it might be like, oh yeah, when people say things like, oh, I can't imagine eating the same thing over and over again for a year for lunch. Like, that's so boring. I can't possibly do it. I challenge you, look back and look at your dietary decisions. And that is one space where you probably have a range of about 4 or 5 things. Like, let's be honest, it's really not as adventurous as you think it is when you look at the macro of it. Day to day, you might feel like it's a different item and you're like, oh, okay, I feel good about this variety, but like chicken with rice is chicken with rice is chicken with rice.
So similar to regret aversion is what's called loss aversion. Mm-hmm. And this actually was very fascinating to me. Again, love me some research, but there's studies that show that the psychological pain that we experience from a loss is greater than the pleasure we experience from a gain of the same magnitude. And the example that they gave was that individuals feel pain from losing $100 twice as much as they would as if they gained $100.
Right. And so that is something that loss aversion, it's actually physically manifests in your brain. Like, they've been able to do MRI studies and see that. And like, it lights up that part of our brain that's like, oh, we are in physical pain because of this. And so that's why it's one of those things where it's actually better for you if you don't get something, because you're going to automatically assign value to it. So one of the people who talks about this a lot is Gretchen Rubin, and she talks about when she goes to a conference, she does not pick up the free stuff, because as soon as you have the free stuff, even if it was free, all of the swag, you're going to assign meaning to it. And it makes it so much harder for you to get rid of it because of loss aversion. You're not going to want to, because you feel like, wait, but I'm losing something, even though you didn't actually put anything out. And so it's funny because they've done other studies on loss aversion where it'll be like, we're going to give you a free mug. Okay. And then somebody else will come in the room and offer you money for the mug, and people will say, they'll either say no or they'll try to get more money. And it's like, it was a free mug and you got offered $5 and you said no, because now you've assigned some, subjective value to this mug. And it's like, but you could have had $5. Like, what was more valuable, right? And that becomes subjective. But for some reason, just acquiring that item and claiming it as mine will make a big difference with people, because now that's the potential. Oh, I'm going to lose the mug. It's like, yeah, but it was free.
It was free, bro.
Right. And so, and why do you decide that it's worth $10 instead of $5? That's why like yard sales are really interesting, because first of all, I love yard sales. I grew up going to all of these things.
She's like a shark.
I love these things, right? And it's something that
I've witnessed it. It's something to be seen.
It is quite beautiful, but it's something I've been doing since I was a kid, right? And I love hosting them, and it's just fun for me because negotiating just goes back to like as me being a little kid. And, but it's always interesting to me when people will want to get what they paid for something. It's like, bro, you've been using this for years. Like, nobody wants to pay you, full value for
freaking flip-flops that have like,
thank you,
freaking foot stain in it. Like, just let it go.
I was going to go for electronic items, but like, yeah, same thing, right? So it's like, nobody wants to do that, but because they feel so strongly about it and they feel the value attached to it. Like, it was funny. One of my friends, when they were moving from Las Vegas, they're like, hey, will you help us with the yard sale? I was like, fuck yeah, I will. Like, I was a damn shark. Like, I just had so much fun. But part of what made it easier too is I wasn't negotiating my stuff. It was like, are you going to give me free reign here to sell your stuff? Because I will get, like, what's more important to you?
I will move the merch.
I will move the merch. And they're like, go ahead. And so I was just like selling things. And they're like, oh my God, like we weren't selling anything until you got here. I was like, that's right. Because I'm willing to negotiate and understand that, there's a line at which point I'm willing to walk away. Because at the end of the day, what do I want? I want to get rid of it, right? Like if that's the goal, or I want to acquire it, right? But I want to acquire it for what I think the value is. But yeah, a loss aversion, when you're going back to the status quo, that is why in organizations, people do not want to change, because they feel like, oh, am I going to lose my position? Am I going to lose my authority? Am I going to lose my autonomy? Any of those things that get threatened, you're going to get a lot of resistance.
What I find to be really fascinating with the loss aversion, and we talked about that people experience losses twice as deeply as they do positive experiences, that one interpretation from these studies that in order for an individual to change, the alternative must be perceived to be twice as beneficial. So coming back to your example as to organizational change, when we don't know how beneficial the alternative can be, we typically tend to assign greater weight to the potential losses. Thus, we choose to stay where we are. I see this all the time in organizational development stuff, right? I don't know. Okay, so now a company is acquiring my company. I don't know how this is going to impact my position, my authority within the organization. And I'm just going to assume the worst. I'm going to assume that I'm going to be losing my job. I'm going to get demoted in some way because I don't know. So that's what I automatically do.
Right. Well, it's that negativity bias that comes in, because it's easier for us to imagine all of the things that are going to hit the fan than it is for us to actually imagine the positive. And so then once the positive stuff happens, you're like, oh, well, I guess that wasn't so bad. But you won't, for some reason, we don't want to let ourselves go there beforehand. I almost feel like it's too much risk for you to be hopeful in those situations.
I think it's not even so much a risk as if it falls short in any way of what you had intended it to be. Now on top of feeling uncertain, now I feel disappointed. Like, well, now it didn't, come to fruition like I had thought it was going to. Now I'm just bummed.
Right. But part of it too is that even if you go through the process, right, and you go kicking and screaming in this change that is being forced upon you, and that ultimately changes the status quo, it'll take some time for you to actually acknowledge, okay, this was a good change. Looking back at it, you can look at it with that 2020 vision and realize, oh, okay, maybe it wasn't so bad. Or it could totally go sideways on you, and you're like, you see, I knew I was right. And then that will keep you in that status quo mentality the next time something is going to happen. Because let's face it, change is something that is inevitable. So this idea of, I want to stay with the status quo, really just seems backwards when you really step back to look at it, because things are constantly in movement. Things are different. The coffee experience that you have today is going to be different than the one that you had yesterday. They might be familiar, but they're really, truly not the same thing.
I 100% agree. 100% agree. And I think another reason why people also kind of adhere to the status quo, and it's something that you and I have talked about so much, especially when it comes to careers, is the sunken cost fallacy. It's like, okay, I've already spent so much time, so much, money, effort. I've spent years at this organization. Like, I can't imagine moving away, and trying something new. I'm just going to stay and tough it out. And it's just like people will continue to invest their resources, time, which is the most, it's the one thing that you can never get back. So time, money, effort into a specific endeavor, because they've already invested so much into this endeavor, even if it's proven not to be beneficial to them, either financially, emotionally, mentally.
Right. And so that includes jobs, that includes relationships, that includes just being in a space that isn't even good for you, because you're like, well, like I think of my parents, right? They have a marriage that does not work. They've been married, more or less 37 years, and probably less than that, because I was at the wedding and I remember it. Justice of the peace. Hey-o. But even with all of that, it's like, this doesn't actually work. But there's this idea of, well, we've been together for over 30 years. We've been together 37 years. Like, I can't leave this. Like, actually, you can. You're choosing not to. And I think that's really what drives me crazy with the status quo is that people, if you at least want to acknowledge that this is a choice that you're making, that you want to be there, that's fine. But people are constantly complaining about where they're at.
Okay, I think that that's what gets me. It's one thing if you've tried something and you failed and maybe, as you're dusting yourself off, you kind of talk about, well, that fucking sucked. And I'll hear you out. But if you continue to gripe about your job or the person that you're with, at some point I'll be like, I'm going to cut you off because it's like talking to a wall. You're not listening to what it is that I'm just basically repeating back to you. You're unhappy based on like this numerous stories that you've told me. I understand that you've been with this person for 7, 8, 9 years. Maybe it's just time to cut it. And that's not to say that the memories you shared were bad. It's just not for you. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. But that fear, right? It goes into that fear of not having the status quo, not having that security, not being in that relationship that will keep people in a space that no longer serves them.
What is it that you say? Is it the devil is safer than the devil you don't? Or
yeah, I think that's how that saying goes.
I mean, and that kind of goes back to the status quo. But no, I think that's one thing that irks me when people are talking to me about life, if it's something I've heard on repeat several times. But also, too, I think another thing that really gets to me is I see the potential in a lot of people. I see how smart they are. And so when they have this negative self-talk, well, I can't go back to school, I'm too old, or I can't change careers, like I've already spent so much time. And it's like, if you could only see the potential I see in you, you would let nothing stand in your way.
I love that you're saying that because I feel like that is the core reason of this podcast, right? Like we are here to celebrate and explore stories of change. And if you are not changing, if you are not evolving because you feel these limitations, like we're here to tell you, no, those limitations are false. All of this is bullshit. That for some reason, whether it's social constructionism, whether it's the words you're telling yourself, all of this stuff, you have been repeating on this loop inside your head. And the reality is you can choose to be in the status quo, but even the status quo isn't the same thing. It's just like this little buffer of where you feel comfortable. And it isn't until you get uncomfortable that you will actually have some growth.
Well, you mentioned it earlier too, which is we're in a world we're basically swimming in a sea of change, and you have to be able to evolve in order to meet the needs of today's either workforce. Technology is advancing us way beyond what we probably ever thought. I mean, I was just talking to someone about how we used to have dial-up, right? And so now you have many computers in your hands, and I just think that by remaining in the status quo is doing a disservice to oneself. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that all status quo decisions are bad. It frees up our mind and our time to do other things because we don't have to make decisions. It's like, okay, I've done it all. I've always done it this way. I'm going to continue to do it this way.
100%. That's where like habits come in, right? When you have built a habit for yourself of a morning routine, a ritual, whatever it is that you want to call it, that's what you're doing. You are saying, this is the status quo that I want to do. And so the challenge that I would have for people really is that intentional? Or are you doing that because that's just the way you've always done it? Because there's a difference there, right? Like if I'm intentionally saying I go to the gym at a certain time, ish, because my trainer is always like, where you at? Our trainer, I should say.
Always late.
I've been on time both times this week. Thank you very much. I feel like I need an award, but anyways.
I'll give you a sticker after this.
Yes. So excited. I love stickers. But there's a difference between being intentional with how you want to build those habits, what you want to be part of your familiar everyday experience, and just being on default of, okay, well, this is what I need to do. I'm turning off the alarm, pressing snooze. And I would rather live life intentionally than by default. What about you?
No, I don't like to sit by and like wait for things to happen. I'd rather, again, this comes back to an episode that we did before on myself where I talk about my need for control. I feel that by taking action, that whatever the consequences are, I can own it because I did it. And I don't want to just stay put. Status quo seriously is the bane of my existence. Like I think I
feel that coming through on this episode.
Yes. Good. Because that is constantly why I'm doing something all the time. Is it healthy? It depends on who you ask. But, to sit still and be idle is like death to me.
Well, and that's really interesting because I did just read a review on a book called Do Nothing. And so I have it up on my queue to read. And it talks about basically how back in ancient times, we did a whole lot less things. There were more holidays, there were these other things. And what the book is promising to do is take us through this experience of learning, hey, this idleness feeling is actually like Protestant values that became dominant during the Industrial Revolution. So I'm like, oh my God.
So wait a minute.
I want to know all about this.
Are you saying that this book is saying that back in the day, we really didn't do as much as we did today? Because I watch a lot of BBC and documentaries, and I look at like people in the 1800s, like women had to cook and clean and sew and milk cows and do all these things. I feel like they did a hell of a lot more than what we do today. I feel like it was more labor intensive, like manual labor.
It might have been more manual labor, but I'm talking like further back where there were more people who were self-employed.
Because they were farmers?
They were farmers, they were tradesmen, they had these other skills. They could set their hours, they could set their pricings, but then once they needed to compete with other things, like I can't wait to talk more about the book, which actually brings me to just like a brief little tangent on this one. We're going to start a book series on Instagram.
Oh yes, I'm really excited. We read a lot.
We are like super nerds. We love reading.
Mine, shocker, I'm sure to no one, is mostly fiction. Usually crime, thriller, mystery, and Siria's is all about self-help and mental wellness. And
not all of it. I read a variety of things, but yes, there's a lot of that. And I've already recorded a couple. I just haven't posted them yet because I wanted to make sure that you guys knew. So if you want to hear more about our book recommendations beyond what we talk about on the podcast, make sure you are following us on the gram on the Pivotal Moments one, because we're not going to post this to our personal pages, just so you know. Anyways, back to status quo.
Yeah, I don't like it. And that's why it was, and that's why it was such a huge thing between my husband and I, because he's the type of person that needs like a fire or, dare I say, an act of God to like come in for him to make some sort of change. So like, which obviously caused some strife between us, but to each their own, right? And I think it was coming to the realization that not everybody is like me. I mean, there can only be one, right? So
there can only be one.
Yeah, but the way that I go about doing things isn't the way that others have to go about doing things. But
so that's interesting though, because the tangent on that one that I want to pull on is really, when you come up with something, are you okay with saying, okay, you can figure out how to do this in a different way? So I'm thinking like businesses have processes, they have, their policies and procedures, and it's like, this is the way it has to be done. Or are you more of like, no, this is the way I do it, but if you find a better way, go for it?
So typically what I do is I don't go into an organization. I usually try to take the collective knowledge of the group. So
yeah, but I'm just talking in like your organization, right? Because you do hire people and.
No, I'm always open to finding better ways of doing something because, especially when it comes to business, because if I don't have to spend that much time, if there's an easier way to do it, then I'm going to try to find an easier way to do it. And just people are so brilliant. I think that's why I'm gravitating towards just social media. I don't necessarily like to post, as Andrew McCorkle from the Cork Bros will tell you.
Who that?
Yeah, he's dead to you. I know.
Who that?
But, I don't like to do it, but I love to see the creativity that people come up with on the social. And I think that's, I like to look for inspiration outside of myself. So if others can, find ways for me to do things differently, then I'm open to it.
I think that's a really fascinating point though, because social media has disrupted the status quo, right? And it's constantly evolving and constantly changing things. And every single time there's an update, what do people start doing? I don't like this thing that they did on the Facebook, blah, 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 blah. Like, people hate it and they're so vocal about it. I mean, when you look at your feeds, guys, and when you are, actively engaged in those things, even just getting a new phone, like Matt still has his phone from,
it wouldn't surprise me if he had like a Razor.
No, he doesn't have a Razor. So we had Samsung.
Sidekick?
No, we had Samsung Galaxy 3s that we got together. I don't know, probably like 2013 or 14 or something. And I have gone through, like, I think I'm on my third phone now. And I keep them longer than the 2 years. He refuses. I was like, here, why don't you use my phone that's not all cracked? And he's like, nope, this works just fine. He is totally fine with the status quo. He's fine with being in just the same space. And, he would be fine with us. And he's told me this. He's like, I would be fine eating the same thing every single day for lunch for the rest of my life. I'm like, part of me is like, that's so boring. But then when I really look at it, like I was saying earlier, like, okay, our lunch varies very little in terms of the variety of it. Like, it kind of go a bit more with the seasons. Like, I don't necessarily want caldo in the middle of summer, but growing up brown, that may have been something. But now that I'm a grown up, I'm only having soup when I want it. Damn it, that's it.
I think in situations like what you're talking about with Matt, though, again, that comes back to status quo being okay, because it does free up your time. Like, for me, since the pandemic, I've been eating the same freaking breakfast every day, literally every day. If
you want to get on Melissa's good side, there are 2 things that you can send to message me, and I'll send you the addresses. They are delicious egg muffin biscuits and honey. Mm-hmm. Those are the things. So if you want to get on her good side, McCorkle.
This guy's got a lot of making up to do. But I mean, it frees up my time because I don't have to sit there and think about what I'm going to make for breakfast. I already know. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to other aspects of my life, the things that I do want to put thought into, things that I do want to be intentional about, that's where the rub comes in when people choose the status quo over trying to be more intentional with their life.
What do you think the difference is between being okay with a habit and, we'll say the status quo, and being like, no, let's do it different?
Again, I think it comes down to potential. That to me is when I see a person's potential and I see and it's hard too, because like there'll be people that I talk with and they'll talk about, there's a mutual friend that we have and she's really into nutrition. And I see her light up when she talks about it, but she's like, well, I can't, I don't know when I'd ever go back because she's undocumented. And so I don't know when I'd ever go back to school or really pursue these things. And for me, these are obstacles. Yes, you are undocumented and worrying about financial aid and all these things and how you're going to pay for it. Yeah, those are obstacles to consider, but they're not unachievable. Like they can be overcome. And so, when I see a person's fire lit and then they just sell themselves short in some way, I think that's where the rub comes in for me.
Mm-hmm. I could see that, especially with that potential, because it is something that, we like seeing people light up. And I say this a lot, but it's totally selfish. I want you to go do what lights you up because it's going to make a better society, period, end of story. You go do that. We all gain something by it. Not only do you get to be in the space that you want to be in and create whatever it is that you want to create for yourself, because you're doing that, you're leading by example, but as a society as a whole, we are gaining so much more. And when you're not doing it and you're just sitting there, being negative, and, part of it may have to do with circumstances like that, right? We all get robbed of your genius, and I don't want you to rob us of that.
We want to hear from you. Where do you land on the issue of status quo? Let us know on our Instagram, Pivotal Moments HQ. We want to thank our producer and music director, Ron Johnson. This has been an Astronomicus DMR production. Thank you for listening. Remember, it's never too late and you're right on time.